In January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed head of government of the Weimar Democratic Republic. German society was undermined by violence. Political tensions were settled in the streets with fists or batons, and the communists represented the first enemy of the state. The Nazi Party also distinguished itself in the use of violence as a weapon of persuasion.
The whole Nazi scheme from the early 1930s was based on finding the right support, especially among conservatives, against those they considered their enemies.
Taking advantage of the disunity of the German left, Hitler appeared to be a shield against the communists, but the Nazis were a minority in the government at the time.
When the Nazis came to power in 1933, they had various opponents. On one hand, those who were their enemies, namely those on the left or who were Democrats, and on the other hand, other opponents who embodied the hard right or the German far right.
To become a majority and establish their power, they did everything to win the legislative elections of March 1933. Hitler then had free rein to take control of the state, destroy the Republic, and establish the Third Reich, a dictatorship in his image, arbitrary and paranoid, the violence of which would strike all those he saw as enemies. The hunt for communists began in great confusion, led by several organizations, including the various German police forces and the militia of the Nazi Party.
Something relatively unprecedented in history happened. The state split. There was the state with its agents, its civil servants, a Nazi state. But at the same time, the Nazi Party set up a whole set of structures that competed with or complemented the state.
The Nazi Party relied on two complementary and competing militias. The SA was created in 1921, and its leader, Ernst Röhm, was loyal from the beginning. From 1930 on, the SA grew from 100,000 to nearly 1 million working-class men, to whom Röhm promised an anti-capitalist revolution. On the other side were the recruits of the SS. Having gone from 280 members in 1928 to approximately 52,000 in 1933, these men were different from Röhm's in that they were fewer in number, selected based on pseudo-Aryan criteria, and trained in Nazi ideology. These were true fanatics led by Heinrich Himmler.
When the curtain raises on the Nazis' rise to power in 1933, he's leader of the SS, which is still under Ernst Röhm and the SA at this time.
But the Nazis were now at the head of a state. Traditionally, states have a political police force whose role is to identify groups that are potential threats. Just a few months earlier, the political police of the Weimar Republic were investigating the communists and the Nazis, but they were now under direct Nazi jurisdiction.
All dictatorships have a political police force, instruments of suppression. Otherwise, they wouldn't be dictatorships.
April 26, 1933, marked the launching of one of the largest criminal organizations in history. Another of Hitler's cronies, Hermann Göring, placed the political police under his direct authority and created the Gestapo, the state's secret police.
First of all, Göring didn't set up a new police force. He simply took over the political police of the Weimar Republic and made it independent. But it was a pre-existing police force. That was the first step.
He kept most of the teams made up of experienced, methodical policemen who had valuable know-how and existing files on the communists. Meanwhile, the Nazis transformed a provision of German law, making it possible to arbitrarily arrest anyone on mere suspicion. This was the Schutzhaft, or protective detention. Used indiscriminately by the SA, the SS, and the police, it allowed for the arrest of thousands of political opponents. Prisons overflowed. Where would all these people be detained? The Schutzhaft went hand in hand with its logical complement, the concentration camps. The very first, Dachau, opened on March 20th, 1933, just weeks after Hitler's rise to power.
At first, after the seizure of power by the National Socialists, the SA created its own sphere of power, so to speak. Savage concentration camps to be used against its political opponents.
Praised by the regime's propaganda, The official purpose of the camp was to rehabilitate the prisoners in conditions that were decent and respectful of them.
The aim was to make people believe that it wasn't that bad. You could go there and visit it. And that's why the camp was presented as an exemplary one, in which everyone had enough to eat, slept fabulously well, and didn't work that hard after all.
The reality was entirely different. In a few months, the camps were filled to the point where they could no longer accommodate all the inmates. They had to constantly create new ones.
Despite the confusion, it proves very effective at crushing organized opposition. 200,000 people are cycled through the concentration camp system in Prussia alone by the end of summer 1933.
Tensions between the SA and the SS intensified.
In 1933, they seized power, and within that power, the SS took over, which was the second step. This wasn't something planned in advance.
Himmler wants to play a key role in realizing Hitler's vision of creating a people's community. The first task is quite simply he needs to centralize the power to be able to have any role within it.
In 1931, Himmler entrusted his right-hand man, Reinhard Heydrich, with the creation of his own spy service, the SD, or SS Security Service, which collected information on opponents of his organization, including their comrades in the SA. In 1934, Himmler took advantage of a long-awaited opportunity. To Hitler, Rome had become troublesome. His brutal methods embarrassed the conservatives, and his ambitions hindered the Wehrmacht, the German army. An alliance of these conservative forces would overthrow the government. The Chancellor had no choice but to get rid of his old friend. Himmler thus allied himself with Göring, relying on the SD files and the methods of the Gestapo to fabricate a plot by the head of the SA against Hitler. On June 29, 1934, began the Night of the Long Knives, which lasted for several days. Hundreds of SA members were arrested and put to death. Ernst Röhm was murdered in his cell.
The SS became more and more important, and the SA was beheaded. There were lists of potential opponents of National Socialism. It was most likely Heydrich who finally decided who should or shouldn't be shot. Several witnesses claimed to have seen Heydrich personally cross off names on those lists.
Rid of their rival, Himmler and Göring shared the profits.
Göring then focused entirely on the economic domain, the four-year plan, and the Air Force, which offered more promising prospects.
Himmler was the big winner of the confrontation. He regained command of the Gestapo and what remained of the SA, and in 1936 became the head of all German police forces. He continued to centralize more and more power until the beginning of World War II. Heydrich became his right-hand man, first appointed to effective leadership of the Gestapo before handling the operational command of this administrative monster.
He was truly the best technocrat of the Third Reich, or one of the best. He was the one who formed the whole repressive structure of the SS.
The event sent a very clear message. In a state completing its Nazi transformation, death would be the fate of those who didn't conform to the leading ideology. Heydrich put an end to the confusion of the first few months. As political police, it was up to the Gestapo to identify the enemies of the Nazi regime. In 1934, it obtained the monopoly of the Schutzhaft.
Protective detention allowed the Gestapo, and from 1934 on, only the Gestapo, the secret state police, to take individuals into custody without any offense having been committed.
Suspicion was sufficient reason to act. Above all, there was no recourse possible before the courts.
This was the primary objective of National Socialists, and of Himmler in particular. To put the Gestapo, the political police, out of reach of the control of the state apparatus, so it wouldn't be subjected to legal checks and balances. Thanks to this prerogative of being able to arrest, torture, and imprison people, the power of the Gestapo increased beyond belief.
In 1935, the first objective was achieved. 600,000 communists were arrested and 2,000 killed in concentration camps run by the SS. By the end of 1935, of the 422 executives of the Communist Party in office in 1933, 219 were in prison, 125 in exile, 24 had been killed, 42 had resigned, and only 12 were on the run.
By this time, it was over in 1935. The communist resistance was virtually crushed, leaving hardly any other after that. At this point, the real question was, what now? It was decided that it wasn't only the political opponents, but everyone who deviated from the image of the desired German citizen, Aryan, in good health, and with National Socialist convictions.
From then on, the Gestapo hunted down Jews, Gypsies, the disabled, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and the marginalized. It organized its sections according to the nature of the individuals.
The internal organization of the Gestapo reflects the way that it sees German society.
The goal was for the Gestapo to become a kind of doctor for the German people as a whole. They had to be freed from all the elements that bothered them politically, but also biologically. This was a whole new mission.
A considerable one, as the Gestapo only had a small number of personnel.
At the beginning of the seizure of power, the Gestapo had 50 employees in Prussia. That's almost nothing. But soon the numbers reached 1,000 or 2,000 people. If you do the math, in a city like Hamburg with over 1 million people, there were maybe 10 Gestapo agents.
But thanks to the Schutzschaft, arrests and detentions in the camps multiplied. At this point, the Gestapo's most effective tool was put into place: fear.
That was pretty logical. When you have such a small organization that has to monitor an entire country, it's impossible to terrorize or imprison everyone. The important thing is that others hear about it and get scared. Such is the principle of terror.
The Gestapo cleverly orchestrated its power. Far from the image evoked by its name, the secret police acted in a very public way, with offices that were visible to all in almost every city of the country.
Everyone knew where their offices were. They were listed in the phone book. People were aware that this institution existed, and everyone knew how to reach it if necessary.
In the beginning, several reports came out in German newspapers, commissioned by the Gestapo or written by journalists. They told of the perfection and infallibility of the Gestapo, its modernity, and to what point it knew everything that happened. It saw everything, nothing escaped it. This was a self-created myth.
It won the support of German society, being presented as the ally of the good citizen, the good German.
The propaganda around political policing makes sure that people understand why enforcement is happening and why the people who are being targeted are being repressed. That allows most Germans to see themselves as immune from the terror. Only 5% experienced constant fear of arrest, and 17% felt an occasional fear.
First against the communists, then against Jews and homosexuals, letters of denunciation and anonymous tips to the Gestapo multiplied.
If the crime is something that involves social interaction, like criticism of the regime or friendship to Jews, then denunciations from the public are absolutely key. When we look at cases of criticism and defeatism, 58% of cases are being reported by the public.
A system of generalized surveillance was established in Germany, in which the key role was played by the citizens themselves. The political police were mostly reactive. The bulk of their interventions were the result of denunciations.
The Gestapo caseload was overwhelming. A backlog somewhere between 30 to 60% was standard. And there was really only time to devote to processing information related to the latest priorities from Berlin.
Officers were overwhelmed with letters of denunciation. Faced with the omnipotence of the Gestapo, people denounced much more than necessary.
This is the case of a 19-year-old man who was denounced by his mother to the Gestapo. As a so-called educational measure, he was sent to the special SS camp of the Hinzert concentration camp. This is a certified copy of the letter that the mother sent to the Gestapo in April 1940. She denounced her son for supposedly being lazy and thought her last educational recourse was to hand him over to the Gestapo so he could learn to work properly. She wrote, among other things, "I feel compelled to point out to you that this one," she was talking about her son, "has been absent from work for more than a week, and that he's hanging out with other slackers like himself. I'm a widow, and all my lessons and warnings have gone unheeded. I certainly can't let things go on like this." Having managed to escape, he sought refuge somewhere before inevitably returning to his mother, who didn't want to report him to the Gestapo a second time. She asked the building supervisor where she lived to kindly inform the Gestapo that her son was back home and that it was best to catch him early in the morning. The Gestapo did just that, of course, arresting him a second time to send him back to a concentration camp. It happened more often than we can imagine that the denunciations came from close members of the family, the mother or the husband, for example. There were often personal reasons behind it.
They needed an iron-willed organization to sort and process these denunciations. As Reinhard Heydrich gained power in the 1930s, he delegated the operational management of the Gestapo to Heinrich Müller, a former Bavarian policeman who was entirely devoted to law and order.
Heydrich finds common ground with Müller over their shared understanding of a threat from Judeo-Bolshevism. And then Müller combines that with immense technical expertise and a fierce work ethic.
This rule and order fanatic started managing the Gestapo, which codified the relations between services, procedures, and investigations. Everything under the aegis of Müller was meticulously organized. A gigantic bureaucracy was set up.
There was originally a sense of German organization, a desire for normative administration, especially in all their repressive practices, in the way they investigated, conducted interrogations, wrote summary reports, and so on. It was extremely standardized with a lot of paperwork.
Many of the documents in such Gestapo files featured precise colors. Protective detention orders were bright pink. Arrest notices were red. From a very pragmatic point of view, it was a relatively simple way to find these files, or elements within them.
Political policing by the Gestapo is fundamentally a matter of paperwork and desk-bound officers.
The last step in the professionalization of the Gestapo was recruitment.
Heydrich, the head of the organization, recruited young college graduates, nationalists and radicals, who had a far more ideological vision.
They were often nationalists, all pretty much anti-communist and anti-Semitic to varying degrees.
This inclination was carefully cultivated. Under the guise of courses and seminars given in police schools, officer cadets underwent intense ideological training, very similar to that of members of the SS.
At that point, they have to go a long 28-month combination of classroom and practical training.
In his image, Heydrich modeled this new generation that gradually supplanted the policemen inherited from Weimar.
This is the idea of a state protection corps, where the SS will infuse their spirit of absolute loyalty and hardness into all of the institutions of enforcement that will guard the new regime against internal enemies of the people.
And the most important of them were the Jewish people. The humiliations, mistreatments, and arrests of Jews increased exponentially. November 1938 marked an infamous turning point, an attack of unprecedented violence and scale.
What's generally known in France as the Night of Broken Glass is a Nazi term that's been out of use for quite some time in Germany, and now called the November Pogrom of 1938. It extended more than a single night. In Berlin, for example, it went on for 3 days and 3 nights, which shows you why using that term makes you lose sight of reality.
On the night of November 9th, Müller sent a secret order to all Gestapo branches. Measures must be taken for the arrest of 20 to 30,000 Jews in the territory. On the night of November 10th, Heydrich ordered the Gestapo to let German citizens take the law into their own hands. At the same time, the state informed the population that no one would be prosecuted for acts of violence committed against Jews.
It's obvious that the state controlled the violence, even if they wanted to give it a popular aspect. Not even behind the scenes, but front and center, the police and various repressive forces conducted and channeled the operations, both in terms of violent acts and arrests.
In total, approximately 30,000 Jews were affected by the Schutzhaft and deported. The racial role of the political police was official and only got worse. Lena Haas shows us the mysteries behind a typical Gestapo case.
This file documents the fate of a Jewish man, Herbert Israel Kerngut, who was described by the Gestapo as a typical Jew. I'll read it out loud. Kerngut has the typical Jewish appearance. His main characteristic is a misleading and elusive attitude. That is, he was portrayed, and I quote, as an incorrigibly asocial person for whom the only solution, from the point of view of society, was to be locked up in a concentration camp. This is the order of protective detention for Herbert Kerngut, which sealed his fate. After his detention by the Gestapo in Trier, he was transferred to a concentration camp and ended up in Mauthausen, where he died.
From then on, the Gestapo's reputation with regard to the Jews quickly spread beyond Germany's borders. The Jewish communities in Europe were warned. Men were stalking them and would relentlessly hunt them down no matter where they were.
The term is common knowledge today, but as early as the 1930s, it was known all over the world. This shows how quickly this police force gained a reputation, not only with the German borders, but abroad.
As Hitler turned to Europe, the Gestapo took on a whole new dimension. In close cooperation with the secret services, it identified influential elites abroad, drew up lists from the Soviet Union to England, and set up informants to infiltrate the countries targeted by the invasion.
They didn't wait until these countries were militarily occupied to set up those informants. They had existed for quite a while. As a result, the Gestapo was able to advance directly behind the Wehrmacht and carried out massive waves of arrests thanks to the collected information.
1938 brought the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by Germany. To guarantee the effectiveness of the conquest, mixed units made up of agents from various services were put into place. Their name, the intervention groups, or Einsatzgruppen.
As their name says, they were sort of a task force. As we say today, temporary units which were always composed of 3 branches. A Gestapo branch for the political part, a Kripo branch for the biocriminal part, and an SD branch for intelligence, which also had an ideological dimension. The Gestapo was the most important organization.
In the absence of local concentration camps, the sentence was brisk. Opponents were taken to discrete locations, gathered, and summarily shot.
From the point of view of the Nazis, it was quite logical to unceremoniously eliminate political opponents in the country you occupied, and to neutralize those likely to form opposing forces and organize a resistance. This couldn't be the mission of the Wehrmacht, as it was tasked with fighting the military enemy and occupying the country.
1939. After the blistering elimination of political elites and opponents in Austria, followed by the same in Czechoslovakia, Hitler had even bigger goals in sight. He targeted Poland and then all the territories in Eastern Europe. Drawn up before the invasion of the country, the list of opponents to be murdered in Poland included about 61,000 names. The Gestapo cast a wide net. Proven or suspected opponents, ever bigger groups of civilians, and sometimes entire villages were massacred. The Einsatzgruppen were divided into commandos, each with a geographical area to be cleansed. Their troops were deployed successively in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and Serbia. Along with assassinating their opponents, they also murdered Jews.
It was very easy for Germans to identify Jews, since in Eastern Europe, west of Germany, Jews were a nationality. There were Jewish quarters in all the cities and villages of Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine, so no special research was required.
In an extremely methodical way, Gestapo agents and their colleagues organized the industrialization of these shootings. Individuals were grouped by the thousands in forests, huge pits, and fields, and shot in waves, one after the other. In order to keep pace with the invasions of Reich troops, the Nazis also sent similar commandos to Western Europe. But in June 1941, Hitler broke the German-Soviet pact. The Gestapo had to take on the USSR, declared an enemy of Nazi Germany.
This was the confrontation with the worst threat against Germany, what they called Judeo-Bolshevism.
This led to a wave of massacres during the summer of 1941. Initially, only Jewish men were shot, and of course communists, even if they weren't Jews. In August, Himmler, who visited the front, decided that Jewish women and children should also be murdered, on the grounds that otherwise, Germany would later have to deal with their revenge.
Eastern Europe became the scene of systematic massacres that would later take the name of Holocaust by bullets. The numbers were dizzying. In Ukraine, in just 2 days, Einsatzgruppe C executed 33,771 Jewish civilians in a fusillade. This was the massacre of Babi Yar in September 1941.
From July 1941 to December 1941, several 100,000 Jews were murdered.
The role of the Gestapo in these massacres was paramount, as its agents formed the majority of Einsatzgruppen officers.
It was above all the young auxiliaries, these very young lawyers from universities who often had just a simple doctorate, who took the lead of these intervention groups and were therefore responsible for the mass executions that ensued.
There, at the heart of barbarism, the importance of their ideological formation was revealed.
These aren't monsters. They're a whole generation of Germany's best and brightest, but they've been brought into a particular worldview, put in a certain situation, and then trained to think about it in a certain way. So this is really about how you create a system that produces mass murderers from normal people.
And yet, even for these young fanatics, murdering men, women, and children with impunity came at a certain cost.
The problem with this is the psychological toll that it takes on the executioners.
Depressive tendencies, generalized alcoholism, so many signs of trauma that in the eyes of the Nazis posed a real problem. They were detrimental to the agent's efficiency.
Einsatzgruppen commanders complained repeatedly that the mass execution of women and children could lead to the degradation of their men. This term is important. Degradation. That's when they started thinking of alternatives.
In August 1941, Himmler made an inspection visit to Einsatzgruppe B. He witnessed a mass execution of 100 people. According to witnesses, Confronted for the first time with the execution of his own orders, even the boss of the SS felt overwhelmed.
When Himmler comes and views an execution, he then begins to smoke, as is described by one of the people who talks to him afterwards, like a neurotic. The guy who comes up to him says, "What are we doing here? We're either training brutes or neurotics for the next generation." That's when you start to see the shift in the style of execution toward an industrial form of killing people.
It was then that the Wannsee Conference was held, which elaborated the final solution.
It was really a meeting where a whole set of leaders were convened. Not political leaders of the regime, but administrative officials. These were members of the Heydrich administration, including Heydrich himself, of course, and Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo.
Heydrich was certainly the architect of the Holocaust. The Gestapo organized the deportations.
Eichmann became the master contractor in Heydrich's service for the murder of the European Jews. He played a coordinating role. He wasn't the only one, but he coordinated the operation on the European level.
They were the ones who decided when and how many Jews to deport. Lists were drawn up. First 150,000, then another 50,000.
The deportations of Jews spread to all areas under Nazi control. Serge Klarsfeld was 6 years old in 1941. Originally from Romania, his family took refuge in the south of France in the unoccupied zone, far from the threat of the Gestapo, at least until 1943.
The Germans immediately occupied Nice and began roundups that were among the most terrible in Western Europe. The Gestapo worked by hand.
They arrested people and potentially carried out physical inspections. They lowered the men's pants to check whether or not they were circumcised.
Serge and his sister received very specific instructions to follow in case their parents were arrested.
We were told to go to a friend's house in the event that our mother was arrested. Being arrested was synonymous with death, and it could happen at any time. That was the reality of Jewish children during the war.
Their father built a double bottom in a closet to hide the children in case of a Gestapo raid.
The Germans arrived. We saw the searchlights on the ceiling around midnight. Immediately, we did what we had to do. We took some clothes and went to the hiding place. My mother and sister and I went, while my father stayed in the apartment. The Germans went up floor by floor, verifying apartment by apartment. Someone must have ratted on us. Our neighbors, for example, had fake documents. We could hear the screaming and yelling. The father shouted, "French police, help! Save us! We're French!" And when they rang, my father opened, and right away, they asked the question. We heard, "Where are your wife and children?" He said we were in the countryside. The Germans started searching. One of them opened the closet door. It was a deep closet that went into the wall, and he pushed the clothes to the side. But he didn't touch the partition. He didn't realize it wasn't a wall. We were silent. My sister stuffed a handkerchief in her mouth so she wouldn't cough, and we stayed like that the whole time the Gestapo was there. They told my father to get dressed. I later found Gestapo search notices for my mother, my sister, and me, marked unknown address. I also found my father on the deportation list. Unfortunately, when he arrived at Auschwitz, he hit a capo who had hit him. He died 6 months later. He was sent to the gas chamber.
Unlike the Klarsfeld children, many didn't have the chance to escape the Gestapo's sudden raids into their buildings. 1942 saw the genocide move into higher gear. The political police filled the new extermination camps with disconcerting speed.
When the Germans killed a person, they tried to find the rest of the family or other Jews they might have known. A lot of that investigative work was recovered using the logic of the archives, such as IDs and photos. We know, for example, that Alois Brunner used physiognomists in the first sense of the term. People who looked at photos, remembered faces, and then looked for them in stations, bus stops, businesses, and so on. This type of police investigation work continued.
By the end of the conflict 3 years later, approximately 6 million Jews had been exterminated. In addition to hunting down Jews, the Gestapo investigated the growing phenomenon of resistance networks. Let's go back to the West in the early 1940s. After the military conquests, the Gestapo established itself in the occupied territories and managed to adapt its organization.
They didn't occupy Holland the same way they occupied Ukraine, and they didn't occupy Ukraine as they occupied France.
What was characteristic of the organization was that it constantly changed. Historians have long thought that this was a handicap, but it turned out to be an advantage, because the National Socialists were able to quickly adapt their structures to the new tasks before them.
In 1941, the Gestapo had close to 4,000 men posted in the occupied territories of Europe.
They were forced to adapt, simply because they were short-staffed. In all of France, they only had 2,000 officers to manage a country of 40 million inhabitants. It was completely insufficient.
For lack of more agents, the men of the Gestapo circumvented the problem by obtaining the support of the governments of the occupied countries.
Vichy fully cooperated with the German authorities, and the French police made massive numbers of arrests.
In the occupied zone, the French police worked with the Germans from 1940 to 1944. When you're a cop from Frankfurt or Stuttgart and you're sent to Paris, Brest, or Nantes, you don't speak French, you don't know the territory, and you don't know the population. They didn't have the means to operate in the occupied zone. Just look at the Veldiv roundup. The Germans couldn't organize it. They had to ask the French police to set up the operation.
At first, Gestapo agents experienced a comfortable daily life. This was the case of the unit stationed in Metz in Moselle, an area annexed by the Germans.
Compared to their colleagues who were assigned to eastern territories, those sent to Moselle found themselves in a land of plenty. They were quite happy to be there. They were partying, they had vacations and predetermined work schedules in the summer and winter, but repression was considerable in Moselle. I estimate that approximately 20,000 people were arrested in the Moselle department alone. That's more than the number of people arrested in the entire region of Normandy.
In the occupied territories, a sudden event was a game changer. In June 1942, the brilliant Heydrich, then at the height of his career, was killed in an ambush by Czechoslovakian resistance fighters.
Heydrich was a legend within the Gestapo and the SS Empire. The regime and the SS organized huge national funerals, deploying unimaginable splendor.
Heydrich's death highlighted a new Europe-wide phenomenon, the rise of resistance networks, which were becoming a priority target of the political police outside of Germany.
If they conducted an investigation on a resistance network engaged in espionage, it would carry out real, effective, standardized police work with agent infiltrations, surveillance, stakeouts, and analysis of material evidence.
Institutional collaboration quickly proved insufficient, particularly in France, and the many requests for reinforcement remained unanswered. Once again, the Gestapo adapted, and opted for an efficient solution: recruiting civilians. Their motivations ranged from simple survival to political conviction to a taste for power and violence.
For certain positions, it was common to have a mind-blowing proportion of 1 German to 10 French, or even 1 German to 20 French. You have to understand that the French ultra-collaborators became full members of the German police, not auxiliaries. These were German police officers who happened to be French. We were dealing with people who were invested with a power that they used and abused abundantly.
Starting with their training in Berlin, the agents were taught to recruit those the Gestapo called trusted men, or V-men, agents both professional and amateur.
There were so-called occasional agents, people who had a certain expertise. A teacher to spy at school, a priest at church, a railroader to listen in on his colleagues at the warehouse. They were trained and recruited from all walks of life. Some came from the underworld, some were hoodlums, others had lost their bearings. The last category were former resistant fighters, either because they couldn't resist torture or they were promised immunity. These often made for the most dramatic cases, for they tended to be the most evil undercover agents. These were traitors who changed sides and who could only see their logic through.
Breaking and using resistance fighters against their own allies proved to be an effective method, which led to one of the Gestapo's great successes, the dismantling of the Alliance Network.
The Alliance Network was an intelligence network that gradually got closer to the British intelligence service. It had great success, was very well organized, and carried the nickname of Noah's Ark, since the agents used animal names as code names. The group was eventually spotted by the Gestapo. A young man was sent by the Alliance to Strasbourg to try to build the network there, since it was an annexed zone. He was arrested in Strasbourg. When questioned by the Gestapo, he talked and explained that he knew a certain hedgehog, and so on. The Gestapo made the connection. Approximately 150 arrests were made, mostly in the south of France. A wave of trials took place from December 1943 to February 1944, and all those convicted were sentenced to death and shot.
It was against this organized resistance that the Gestapo deployed its most radical methods, using torture during the interrogations.
Not to be pejorative, but let's not forget that many resistance fighters were amateurs, not professionals. They had never been interrogated at all and were up against people with 25 years of work experience. The fight was quite imbalanced.
These torture sessions reinforced the legend of the Gestapo throughout the world. Its agents, professionals in the manipulation and extraction of information, used a wide range of methods to break the interrogated, from the most subtle to the most brutal. Despite resounding successes in the battle against resistance fighters, pressure was mounting on Gestapo agents, and even more so in the heart of the Third Reich, as the Germans had imported forced labor from all over Europe. This host of potential enemies needed to be watched. In September 1944, there were nearly 6 million forced laborers, including more than 2 million Soviets, who represented potential communist rebels. In agriculture, nearly 1 in 2 workers was imported from abroad, and 1 in 3 in the construction, mining, and metalworking industries.
This constituted a new problem, because the Nazis were also the most xenophobic party in German history.
This is a real issue for the Gestapo because they view every Soviet citizen as a potential communist revolutionary.
People were arrested for arriving late, for being lazy, for not taking off their caps when passing a German engineer. They were often arrested and hastily sent to concentration camps.
Workers from the East, considered subhumans in Nazi ideology, were particularly watched.
They also meticulously verified whether Polish and Russian forced laborers had contact with Germans. If they had sexual relations with German women, they were publicly hanged.
As the war stalled, Hitler saw the situation turn against him. For the Wehrmacht, the Eastern Front had been a disaster since 1942. Everywhere in Europe, underground forms of resistance were strengthening. The Allies were preparing to land in the West. Many agents who had been active in the East were redeployed to head new sections, including in Germany. The objective was clear: to tighten up the crackdown. The good Germans, relatively spared until then, began to suffer the pressure and violence of the political police.
Starting in the fall of 1944, the terror and general surveillance of the Gestapo turned to its own population again, because it was feared, rightly or wrongly, that enthusiasm for the war had diminished, and adherence to the regime had declined following the bombings and the prospect of defeat. The terror suffered by the German population intensified. The number of incarcerations and concentration camps increased. New felonies were invented, such as weakening the military force, an inexplicable concept. The size of the Gestapo staff increased continuously until the end of the war. I think they reached 30,000 or even more.
Faced with an increasingly difficult management of populations, the political police experienced a process of decentralization for the first time in its history.
Along the western border, the Gestapo decentralizes to maintain control as the Allies arrive.
The Allies were approaching. They had no time to check if a person was really guilty or not.
Given the urgency to maintain order, the strict respect for hierarchy and bureaucracy began to crack. The local branches of the Gestapo were allowed to resort to a procedure known as special treatment without having to wait for Berlin's approval.
Special treatment usually meant summary execution.
In the spring of 1945, the Allies continued to advance toward Germany. Hitler sent the Nero decree to all administrations. Any compromising trace of the regime had to be destroyed. The resulting systemic destruction of archives remains one of the causes for our lack of knowledge about the secret police.
The Gestapo itself deliberately destroyed files so that its crimes couldn't be documented.
May 1945 brought panic. In Berlin, the leaders went all in. Gestapo executives fled the capital. Himmler himself secretly tried to negotiate with the Allies. Müller was one of the last fanatics who stayed with Hitler in his bunker in Berlin until the end. He disappeared without a trace under mysterious circumstances. In November 1945, the first international trial of Nazi criminals began in Nuremberg.
At first, the Allied investigators didn't attribute much importance to the Gestapo. They focused more on the Wehrmacht and the SS, but they gradually became aware of the role played by Gestapo units in the occupied countries, a role so important the Gestapo as a whole was declared a criminal organization at the Nuremberg trials.
With the war over, the very special skills of former Gestapo agents became attractive in the new context of the Cold War. Post-war German society even saw the careers of ex-Gestapo agents flourish in the new spy services in the West.
By the 1950s, the situation had changed and most, but not all, Gestapo agents were reinstated in the civil service and even received their pension.
Other fugitives offered their experience to authoritarian regimes in South America as well as the Middle East.
The police know-how of the fight against the Jews and the Judeo-Bolsheviks was seen as beneficial against the USSR because they knew how to do it. They had methods, knowledge, and they knew the communist enemy.
From its creation in 1933 to its disappearance in 1945, the Gestapo was complicit in all Nazi crimes. Enjoying exorbitant powers, it guided the dizzying massacres of entire communities during the Holocaust by bullets, hunted down resistance fighters, and organized the deportation of Jews and other undesirables to the camps, tipping into a frenzy of murder and brutality pushed to an extreme.
In the last days before the Allies reached the cities, the Gestapo commanders often did one last thing. They took 20, sometimes 200, or more forced laborers from prison, mostly Russians, shot them before throwing away their weapons and uniforms and disappearing, even though there was no real threat. That means some sort of reflex had developed, the reflex of violence. Most were surprised to have survived. And a few years later, they once again became police officers in Germany.